Okay, let's go ahead and get started. It's quiet enough and we can kind of adjust as we go. So appreciate everybody being here and, being patient with the fact that I had to punt from last week. And so I hope everyone's well. Today we're going to focus on these two genealogies. So the story that leads up to the flood is the story of two family lines. Okay, we get these two genealogies, the genealogy of Cain and genealogy of Seth. And because we're looking at these two family lines, it's important to just remember that in Genesis 1 through 11, we're talking about the stuff that all of us are made of. Okay, nobody here, nobody today is just from Cain or just from Seth. Okay, the lines converge, they mix, and we all have both, right? So that's important because the way that this is depicted, there's kind of questions raised, and they're questions that are all about all of us, right? It's not about some kind of person over there and not me. It's all about all of us, okay? And what we see in both of these lines, these family lines, is that they both have achievements that are significant of different types, right? And both end up in a very bad place, okay? By the time you get to kind of the end of what we're looking at today, early in Genesis chapter 6, every thought of the human heart is only evil all the time, okay? And so both of these lines, despite one looking a whole lot more promising than the other, both end up in a really dark spot prior to the flood, okay? So these are stories of decline. But it's also important to kind of put this in a larger picture of how the Bible works, which is this. Remind me, take Jesus out of the picture for the second. Remind me, who is perfect in the Bible if you exempt Jesus? Yeah, nobody, right? And part of what the Bible does is it trains us how to admire flawed people. Okay? And it's really, really important because that's the only kind we have around. Okay? And just because there's flaws doesn't mean there aren't also admirable qualities that we need to learn from and imitate and so forth. And so there's this kind of discernment that we're taught by being given pictures of people in all of their complexity, flaws as well as virtues, right? And it's the mix there that we're called to kind of admire and imitate, but with discernment, okay? So we're going to trace these two lines of kind of Cain and Abel, and they're really laid out where you're supposed to compare them. Like most of the names are almost identical, right? Some of them are the same. And there's kind of patterns in both of them that are kind of begging us to do this compare contrast between them, okay? So it's kind of part of how Scripture teaches is it brings similarities and differences to us in such a way that it makes us ask questions if we're attentive, okay? So before we kind of look at this line coming down from Cain that we did a little bit last time, but I want to return to this theme that was really central to what went on between Cain and Abel, and I want us to develop that a little bit because I think it's essential for understanding what's going on here. And that theme is the face. And what it means to look into the face or refuse to look into the face of another person. Okay? So you'll remember last time, Cain doesn't acknowledge Abel. Like Abel's Cain's brother, but Cain won't ever say, "This is my brother," right? And he won't look at him. But then he becomes very upset when he brings an offering and God won't look at him and look at his sacrifice. That's what have regard for behind that. What was it, shara? is to gaze at, right? To look at. And so there's a lot going on there. And so he's upset. So, his face falls. He won't look at his brother. So what's going on here with either looking at somebody or refusing to look at somebody? Okay. I want to unpack that. The primary, kind of the primordial, the most basic connection between persons is the face when we look at each other. Okay? And one way to think about this, part of what you could ask is like, what's a body? Right? What are bodies? And let me just suggest that a body is a focal point for personal presence. Okay? When I want to get in touch with Yanis, I know where to find him. Okay? He's going to be here. Now that I can't like open up his body and find him inside. He's not that way, but his presence kind of comes through there. And so if I want his attention, I go and talk to him. I know where to find him. Now, so the body as a whole is a focal point for personal presence. And you can get my attention by tapping my shoulder and you'll know that I'm there. You kind of draw me back. But the face, it's as it were the most translucent, the most personally translucent part of the body. Something like that, right? It's where people shine through. It's where you meet a person. You meet a person if you look in his face, if you look in her face, right? And that's where we see pain, right? And we see delight, and we see confusion, and we see aha, right? And we see if a person's really there. Like we've had conversations where you realize you look at the face and, their body's there, but that person's somewhere else a little bit, right? And you can see when they come back, right? So the face, it's really, really central for any kind of a connection between persons, okay? Now, it's not just there. The face isn't just a place to study a person, to figure out things about him or her. The face is also where we realize a responsibility for that person, right? When you see a person, when you're willing to look into the face, if there's pain, it calls out. If there's confusion, you kind of feel the need to do something, right? Explain, right? There's a kind of responsiveness that comes from this connection when we're willing to look into the face of another person, okay? Now, when we want to ignore a person, we just ask, I'm going to assume that other people have had this thing of wanting to avoid a person who's begging. How many of you look that person in the face if you want to ignore or walk by? No, there's this, the face falls, right? You kind of look away if you want to not deal with this as a person, right? With this person as a person. And so the face, it's really, really basic. And as it were, we discover morality through connecting with another person, but with the face, okay? By seeing their face. Now, it's also a fundamental human need, and this goes all the way back to like birth, to the earliest days of a human life. It's a fundamental need. Psychologists will talk about it as attachment, right? That if there's no attachment or faulty attachment, become ill, even die. I mean, it's a biological necessity to attach. Okay? But concretely, what's attachment look like? You hold that baby, and the baby has this amazing capacity to just stare into your face and doesn't blink and doesn't become ashamed and look away. It can just look into your face like endlessly. It's amazing, right? And the one need that it has is another face looking back, right? That you're seen, you're welcomed, you're loved, right? That's it. And so that connection between the face, it's what brings somebody from just kind of being, as it were, a biologically human to being a human person, right? Is welcomed into a community and attached by face-to-face connection, okay? And that continues, like that's the basis of kind of discovery of morality, right? Now, is we look people in the face and that calls out to us and we have to do something, right? We have to be something because of that. Now, part of what we pointed out as we went through Cain and Abel is the fundamental flaw in Cain is that he wants, remember his name means control, right? And he has this sense that he's focused on gaining control of the world. So he interacts with God in a certain way, like, let me give you this and you give me something back, right? And also then he doesn't have much use for his brother, so he doesn't want to look at him even, right? And so the way I put it is, a brother, as a brother, doesn't ask, what's a brother good for, right? There's, as we meet another person in the face, one of the primary things that we see, that we experience, is that it is wrong to use this person for something else, right? That people have a sort of sanctity, right? They're not to be used as tools for something else, but they're to be responded to in some way, okay? Now, so what happens when one refuses to look at the face, right? That's a lot of what the Cain kind of story is about. And this is going to lead to something that I think has a lot of contemporary relevance. So that's why I'm wanting to go back and kind of scratch at this a little bit more. So the first thing that you'll notice is that if you're not looking at persons' faces, you tend to look at other parts of bodies, right? And that's part of instrumentalizing. It's part of treating another person as if they're there for use rather than as a sacred something, as one to meet, okay? Another thing that happens is, and this becomes more and more the case that we see in our world, I think, is that we can kind of divorce the words of a person from the person when we aren't looking at the face, okay? And this happens especially now, with like online things, right? Where the face is absent, right? Now, part of why I want to kind of focus on this is that I don't think it's accidental that Cain, the one that won't look at his brother's face, the one that wants to instrumentalize everything, is also the one who's the beginning of his line brings out some great technological achievements. Okay? The first of them being the idea of sacrifice. That's Cain's idea, right? God doesn't ask for it. Cain thinks, hey, maybe I do this and God will give me back, right? But then beyond that, the first city, right? Cain's supposed to be a wanderer, but instead he founds a city, right? And then as you go through that line, you get down to the 7th generation, and you have Lamech that takes these 2 wives, and they have kind of 2 children each, and you have all of these technological advances that take place out of that line. You have, as it were, the food industry, those that live in tents and keep livestock, right? Again, that's there to make the city work, right? You got to feed it somehow. You have those that produce music, kind of wind and string instruments, come from another one of of Lamech's children. And then you have another that you have bronze and iron, as it were, the weapons of war and of, kind of proto-industry, you could say, right? And then perhaps also there's a sister, Nama, which means something like lovely, I understand. Maybe this has to do, I don't know, but perhaps this has to do with something like cosmetology, right? And so anyhow, there's these technological advances. And let me suggest that by putting it in this line, it's just marking, as it were, a kind of ambivalence. It's not saying this is all bad. I don't think the Bible is, as it were, like technophobic, if I could put it right. It's not that. But it does kind of highlight that it comes out as part of this whole kind of mix in human character of good and bad, and there's noble achievements and tendencies to twist them and misuse how they're used, right? And so it's, as it were, it's not so much a matter of praise or blame, but a call for discernment. Okay, a call for discernment and how we interact with technologies that seems to be built into this. Okay, I'll just kind of point out also that there's this we're going to get at the end of this time to one of these really kind of controversial and bizarre passages with sons of God and daughters of men and what's going on there, and are these like angelic beings and all of that. But what I'll just point out is that there's a line of interpretation, of ancient interpretation, that kind of looks at the arrival of significant technologies in human life as a type of revelation that's kind of a bad revelation. You just say that, right? Like coming from angels, as it were, leaking things they're not supposed to, something like that, right? So we'll come back to it. But this is kind of there, and you have a similar thing in Greek and other thought forms. So remember, like the whole Prometheus thing, that myth that you get in. So it's in Hesiod, and then it's developed in Plato, and maybe Aeschylus is included there. But this idea of the one that steals fire from the gods to give to humanity because humanity can't make it on his own otherwise, right? So there's this sense of like technology's needed, but it comes from beyond us, and maybe we don't have a right to it. And how do you fit that all together, right? So there's like this complex of issues that's there in a number of these ancient traditions, okay? So just leave it at that for this second. Let me come back to this kind of technology and what it means to look in somebody's face and just kind of raise a contemporary issue with this, okay? The contemporary thing is this. A number of people have noticed that interactions online through kind of social media platforms tend to gravitate towards becoming kind of more harsh, more shrill, more angry in the way that people interact, in the things said, right? And I understand there's kind of algorithmic things happening in the background, that you get the whole echo chambers and all of that, and that's a real element. But let me just kind of raise this as a question. Like I have a question about this. Does it have something to do with the fact that it's faceless? Right? That when I interact with somebody's words in a way that I don't see their face, right? I don't see the person when I hear their thoughts. That it has this way of kind of removing from me the moral inhibition, that sense of responsibility that I would have in responding. If I saw it coming from your face, I would respond differently. I would know to respond differently than if it's just kind of words on a screen, right? it seems to me very possible that the removal of the face as kind of the medium of interaction has this way of deadening our moral senses. Okay? And so let me just suggest that there's something lost. Try it on. Okay? Just try out the thought. There's something lost when we evaluate the words without the faces. And let me give you kind of a biblical analog that the face is still there, but it's as it were what happens when you move from primarily looking at somebody's face to primarily engaging what the person's saying. And it's this. Think of what happens with Job. Okay? Super great guy. I mean, outside of Jesus, if there's somebody perfect in the Bible, it's Job, right? Right? It's just like he's the guy who does everything right, and then everything wrong happens to him, and he's destroyed. And these friends come, and they see him from a distance, and they don't even recognize him. When they recognize him, they're just they're torn apart, and they sit down in shock and silence, and for 7 days, they just sit in mourning with him, right? Incredible empathy, right? They see his face, they know his pain, and they just sit with him, and it's beautiful. And then they start talking, right? And what happens is, as soon as Job, he bursts out, and so they start responding to his words, and you get this back and forth in the words. And what happens by the middle of that set of interactions, the people that are like sitting down and kind of grieving for Job are like, you had worse coming. You know, they're like accusing him of the worst things. And what's happened? There's been this shift from interacting with a person primarily in terms of the face to a kind of a battle between my ideas and his ideas, right? And there's something when we begin to think that the world's primarily about which ideas win rather than how we receive the person, that tends to spiral in this direction of harshness and incrimination and so forth. Okay? A thought. Okay? So we see this with kind of, I think this is like a key message of what's happening here with Cain's line. Okay? Now, Seth's line, it looks really, really promising. Okay? Chapter 4, 25. Adam has relations with his wife, knows his wife again. She gives birth to a son, names him Seth, which has this connection with saying or appointing. And she says, well, God's appointed for me another seed in place of Abel that Cain killed. And then the first thing that we get after that, verse 26, to Seth is born a son. His name, he calls him Enosh, which it's very similar to Adam. It means like human being, right? But it has this sense of like mortal, right? So there's this kind of like awareness of mortality, right? And this line is important. So, and at this time, men begin to call upon the name of the Lord. Okay, so you have, as it were, this new line in touch with mortality in some way, and prayer is the big invention, right? So, and in fact, this is going to kind of mark, you don't get technological inventions going down this line until of a sort with Noah, right, with an ark. But we'll get there next time. Prayer here, so kind of there's this, it begins in this line, you have people that are calling upon the Lord, and let me just point out something. There's a sense of, I think the Lord, bespeaks God as one that's present and available in this way. If you go back to Genesis 1, you get the kind of the cosmic creator, the top-down account, and it's all Elohim. It's just God that does all this, right? And then like 2:4 and following, the Eden account, it's the Lord God. It's Hashem Elohim, right? So this particular name, special name, Hashem, it's the YHWH. I say Hashem, means the name, okay? Or you could just say the Lord. So Lord God. And then when you get to Cain and following, it's just the Lord. And so there's something going on, like from God being the most transcendent way of thinking, kind of the top down. And when you get to the bottom up account, when God's digging in the dirt and making a clay man and blowing into his face and all of that, now it's the Lord God. And the Lord side, it's like the intimacy, the availability of God is kind of foregrounded in some way. That's the same name in which with the breeze of the day, the voice of the Lord comes to talk, right? So it has to do with this availability. And so here, it's men don't begin to call on the name of God. It's on the name of the Lord. It's this Hashem, this name, right? And so it has to do with kind of the availability here, like here in everyday life of God, okay? Now, that's a different approach. Just think about, instead of kind of instrumentalizing and coming up with technologies to bolster life, there's this line that what I'm going to do is I'm going to interact with God as a way of making my way in this world. I'm going to call upon the Lord. Okay? It's pretty promising. Okay? Now we can't forget this still ends up where it does, but this is promising. Okay, so there's this human issue. Now we go from here into chapter 5, and this is where everybody falls asleep and stops reading, okay? I'm just going to say, hold on, because it turns out there's something, I think, super interesting in this, like tucked away in this genealogy with all of the, the years and all of that. So the human issue is hiding in the genealogy, okay, of chapter 5. So this line, it begins with discovering prayer. It kind of peaks halfway through, we might say, with Enoch in the 7th generation from Adam, who he walks with God until God takes him, and so this kind of this one possibility of a life beyond death, so forth. But then after that, it rather quickly degenerates until by the time you get to the beginning of chapter 6, so there's like 10 generations in this genealogy. By the time you get to the end of it, we're told that wickedness marks every thought of the human heart all the time. Okay? So you have this line that begins with the discovery of prayer. They're in touch with their mortality, with like just, I'm a human being, nothing more, and I'm calling upon the Lord. And then something happens where every thought of that line is only evil all the time. Okay? That's a pretty sharp turn. What happened? Okay? And now the answer to that, the what happened, comes from paying attention to the boring details of the genealogy. Okay? So here's the thing. The secret is you got to count the years. Okay? Now, here's the deal. I know that counting years in biblical genealogies has a really bad reputation because people thought they could figure out the whole Earth's birthday doing that. Okay? Now, I'm not suggesting that. All right? Maybe somebody else wants to. That's not what I'm doing here. But let me just say, as what we do have here is a kind of a narrative world being constructed. And in order to appreciate this, you have to read it. Let's just take it seriously. Here, whatever the age of the earth is, we'll just say that the reason we're given the number of years, he lives a certain number of years, then becomes the father, lives a certain number of years before he dies. Right? This other guy lives a certain number of years before becoming a father. It's setting us up to be able to kind of count the total years of life relative to each other within this line. Now that's important because here's what comes out. I won't actually do the math in front of you, but what happens if you just kind of add up the ages at which they're begotten relative and kind of keep tabs of that relative to when people start dying? What you see is this. Here's the secret, okay? Up until the point where Methuselah fathers Lamech, the Lamech in this second line, because there's a Lamech in Cain's line, right? And that happens, if I counted correctly, like 872 years in, okay? Up through that point, you have all 9 generations from Adam on alive at the same time. There has been no natural death within this narrative world. Nobody has died naturally. Now, Cain has killed Abel. We're aware there's a possibility of violent death. And you have this whole line that are developing weapons of war and so forth. That's in Cain's side, right? And so we know you can kill each other. But there's this other line that has this kind of humble, prayerful approach to life. And as you follow them down, you have from Adam all the way up through Lamech, right? Everybody's alive at the same time. Nobody has died. They were told, eat the fruit and you die, but they don't. They don't. And they have this long lifespan. It's not till 930 years that then suddenly Adam drops dead. Right? And then you go on a few years and, Enoch vanishes, the Lord takes him. And then at 1,042 years, if I counted right, Seth dies, right? So you get this, like between 930 years and 1042, so there's this window where nobody else is born, but you have the first kind of natural death enter the world, okay? Now, just imaginatively think about this for a second, right? So what would it be like to live in a world where nobody's died naturally, right? Well, what it means is, like, I can imagine maybe I go on forever. Maybe I don't have to die. I mean, I'm living with other people that are calling on the name of the Lord. I've got this kind of good life going on. I'm not like chasing battles like the Cain line. I'm doing this other thing, right? Maybe this is unending. Maybe I can just get better and better, right? And this happens within, there's going to be, as it were, like a living memory of Eden. I mean, imagine that. Like, you got this guy that was there, right? And he can, like, yeah, we chose the fruit of ambiguous understandings instead of the tree of life, instead of wisdom, and here we are, but we're doing the best we can now. There's this like connection all the way back, right? And then, boom, it's severed. He dies, his son dies, and now the first person born in a world where death is already a fact, not just as a possibility because of violence, but an inevitability for every last person. Nobody gets out alive, 100% mortality, we're all going, and Noah's born. Okay? So the human issue that's tucked away inside of the genealogy is, what do human beings do with this awareness, this sure knowledge that death's coming for them? Okay, we're all mortal. All right, that is the issue of the generation of the flood. Okay, that's where this sharp U-turn takes place, right? And you go from the line that is calling on the name of the Lord, and they become the generation in which every thought of the human heart is always evil all the time. There's something in kind of the ordinary human response to mortality that challenges our basic morality. Okay? Now, This is a really important, and by the way, I mean, we're not going there. Maybe later, Harry can do this for us in a follow-up. But like Athanasius, this connection between, on the incarnation of the world, this connection between mortality, like sliding into non-being, and the loss of moral ordinate, direction, that's like a key thing that's dealt with. So, but it emerges here. It emerges here as the issue, right? What do we do knowing that death is coming for us, right? Well, so Noah's born, and Lamech, it's interesting, you said there's these kind of parallelisms between the two lines. So Lamech in Cain's line, he's the guy that takes two wives, right? And his children like produce all these great things as far as like war and technologies. But he's also the one who boasts a greater vengeance than God. If Cain will be avenged 7, I'll be avenged 70 times 7, I'll kill a man just for bruising me, I'll beat up, just even if it's just a boy, I'll kill him, right? There's this kind of bragging, right? And so he's given, he's the seventh in the line, he's given the speech, and now Lamech in Seth's line, he also says some words. He speaks now as the one who's fathered Noah, the first one to be born with death as an inevitability in the world. And what does he say? I'll name him Rest. Noah, rest. And because he'll give rest, he'll give comfort, right, to those that toil, have, as it were, futile labors because of the cursed soil. So there's something here about connection with the soil also that we may loop back to if we've got a moment here. Okay, so all of that leads us up to the generation of the flood, okay? And this is where, well, let me do the part, let's just stay like strictly human, right? Before we deal with the weirder stuff, okay? So chapter 6, the first, say 5 verses. With this in the background, remembering that kind of the issue that's just come to the fore through the genealogy is now everybody knows everybody's dying. So just pause and think for a second. And there's all sorts of other literatures that reflect on the same thing. How do human beings, what's like the natural response, right, to this knowledge of death? Well, there's, as it were, we see in other literatures, think of Homer, right? This craving for immortality. You can't have physical immortality, so what do you do instead? What happens in Homer? Well, you get it from kleos, right? It's this, glory, right? You make a name, and the name will be remembered forever. And how do you do that? Well, it's something pretty similar to this. Chapter 6, first several verses, reads this way. Now it came about when Adam began to multiply on the face of the land and daughters were born to them, that the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were good, beautiful, and they took wives for themselves, whomever they chose. And the Lord said, my spirit, I'll just do this literally, will not judge within Adam forever, because he also is flesh. Nevertheless, his days shall be 120 years. Now the Nephilim, or the fallen ones, right? These are usually translated, these are giants. They're connected up with the idea of giants later. Were on the earth in those days and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they were, and they bore to them, and these were the mighty men of old, men of name, men of reputation, okay? And then the Lord sees that the wickedness of man was great on the earth. Every intent of the thought of his heart was only evil continuously, and he was sorry, and it goes on, Okay, we'll stop there for now. We'll come to flood and all that next time. Okay, so how do human beings respond to this awareness of mortality? Something like trophy wives and epic battles. Okay, it's, predictable in a sense, right? It's like, I can't live on myself, but what I can do is I can do something impressive enough to have a name, and that name will last. It'll carry on, right? It's this way of trying to deal with a denied immortality with this kind of surrogate immortality, okay? Again, great similarity to Homeric heroes and other ancient literatures as well, right? Now here's the interpretive issue. So here's all the weird stuff, okay? And I was going to ask Pondelis he was going to solve it, but he's not here, so he'll have to do it next time. But anyhow, so who are the sons of God, daughters of men? Like, what's going on there? And just kind of point out there's two primary lines of interpretation. And I'm going to suggest a kind of both and solution, if I may. But so there's the, as it were, the Enoch tradition that you see in the Second Temple kind of literature. Actually, it's kind of ambiguous how far back First Enoch goes, kind of, but it's definitely Second Temple. By the way, Second Temple, just to be clear, is the temple that's built after the return from exile. So it's in the late 500s of BC. So say 500 years before Christ. Now. And that tradition, what it does is it picks up on the figures that you have other places in ancient biblical literature in which the sons of God refer to something like a divine court. Okay, these are later referred to as angels, and they get translated in the Septuagint as the angels of God, right? But for instance, in Deuteronomy 32, the sons of God, right? And in Psalm 82, and at the beginning of Job, the sons of God are these kind of heavenly beings. They're not God, they're not the creator, but they are immortal beings in the heavens that have been created. Okay, and so one reading is that these sons of God here are these kind of immortal beings who come down and have sexual intercourse with the daughters of men, with human women, okay? Now, that account is something that was developed very thoroughly by the Enoch tradition, and it's now it's easy to kind of dismiss traditions that are accounted to ancient figures in Second Temple literature as like, well, it's all pseudonymous, it's written under fake names, and it's just fancy. But the Enoch literature is a little more difficult because it turns out it's pretty important to Jesus' family and to the early Christian movement, to the early Jesus movement, right? So, I mean, it's quoted, kind of alluded to in Jude and in 2 Peter. It may be somewhat in the background of what's going on in how Jesus interacts with the demons. And it also, in all likelihood, is kind of implied in the background of kind of the structure of Luke's genealogy, okay, into kind of 7 groups of 7. As opposed to 3 of 14 that you get in Matthew. And we can chase that sometime if you guys want to. There's a very early Christian I believe it's through Hegesippus. It's of course in Eusebius, but is where it's preserved. But Hegesippus, I believe, it may have been Julius Africanus, but I think it's Hegesippus, that has this tradition of the family of Jesus having a special mission where they travel from their home villages in Kokhba and in Nazareth, and they take with them this genealogy and the Book of Weeks. And using that, they interpret the genealogy to show that Jesus is Messiah, okay? Now, here's why that matters. The Book of Weeks, it's a section out of 1st Enoch, okay? So anyhow, that's one of the reasons why it's a little bit difficult to just kind of dispense with the Enoch stuff, okay? Now, if you want somebody who interprets in light of this Enoch tradition, and these are just angels coming down and, and taking human women, and now you've got giants coming out. There's this guy named Michael Heiser. He passed recently, but he's become very well known pretty recently. I read him before many knew him, but he's got a book called The Unseen Realm, and you can chase that, okay? Now, here's the thing. So that's one line of interpretation. Okay, there's this other line of interpretation, which is that what's being described here as the sons of God versus the daughters of men are the line of Seth versus the line of Cain. And it's about these two coming together. And you have different versions of who's which. Is it the line of Cain that's the sons of God and the daughters of men are from Seth, or vice versa, right? You can argue that either way. But these are the two kind of primary streams of interpretation, kind of the supernatural sons of God versus the two lines coming together, okay? Let me suggest there's a possibility of reading this in a kind of both-and way that's rooted in ancient Near Eastern kind of history, how the and kind of a conceptuality that comes from that. Okay, so here it is. Oh, let me say one other thing. Part of how you decide how much to weight Enoch in how you interpret this little bit of Genesis 6 has to do with a question of composition date, and I don't have the answer to this. Okay, Nathan probably does. You can ask him. And here's the question. Okay, so you have scholars like Joseph Blenkinsop is a good representative of this, that has the Torah, like these 5 books, the final composition, like everything, like all the different strands brought together, and like the final version, that it happens in the Persian period, which would put it late enough that it's possible that you already have 1st Enoch. In which case, this is how he does it. He says it's possible that actually Genesis 1:6-1-4, it's a condensation of the larger Enoch story, rather than the other way of doing this is if you have an earlier composition of this, then it's that, well, you have this kind of ambiguous passage, and Enoch develops this out of a kind of this crunchy little ambiguous passage in Genesis 1:6-1-4. Okay, so those are two different kind of questions, just like at the historical interpretation level. I'm going to set both of them to the side for a moment for this reason, because I think there's a way for both of these to come together in this way. Okay. Okay. Say one other thing. Whether or not Enoch is written first and this is a condensation or vice versa, what is clear is that it's the human side that's foregrounded in what's going on here. I mean, that's implicit by putting it in this whole genealogy, setting it up with human beings becoming aware of mortality in the way that the years are developed in that, right? It's foregrounding the human element. Even if there's this second element of kind of like supernatural beings. It's the human that's being foregrounded. So that's why I went the direction I went up to this point. Now, here's how these could come together. Just try it on. Super weird. It's weird stuff wherever you go here, okay? There may be a sense of something like what we would call maybe hybrid conception in this way. Here's the historical background. There is in the ancient Near East this idea of sacred marriage in which Mesopotamian kings had a sort of ritual sex in a temple precinct in which that king was supposed to be inhabited by this pagan god. So Marduk comes down and the king embodies him in having sex with the queen, right? At the special time within the year and so forth, right? One way of reading this, remembering, let me do one other thing. That often happens in these structures, which are called ziggurats, which are going to kind of appear later when you get to the Babel story. We don't have the word ziggurat, but it's almost certainly the Tower of Babel is a ziggurat, right? Okay, so, and there's this connection between those two things. Here you have their men of name, and what's going on in Babel? We want to, the motive, we don't want to scatter, instead we'll make a name for ourselves, okay? Maybe there's something there, I don't know, but the idea here would be that there's an invoking of powers that are supernatural through this kind of ritual sex that then produces this kind of offspring, okay? Now, let me try to frame this in terms of something that's already there back in earlier in Genesis. Okay, we've pointed out already that like back in chapter 2, verse 5. In this second creation account, like the first one, everything's top down and God just kind of calls things into being. The second one, it begins with this kind of land in which there's not yet any grass of the field or plant, but there's like intrinsic principles in the soil. They haven't yet sprung up because there's a need for God to do something and man to do something. God and human interaction together has to bring the world into play in some way, into existence. Okay? So part of what's going on here, that this would be a kind of a repetition of at a different level, would be a big issue that I would call something like this. Okay? And it's an issue that kind of, this will pop out. It's not only in Scripture, it's something that we have to deal with in the world more broadly anyways. And something like this. Okay? What is the relation between the information, kind of spiritual realities, and then the bodies in this material world that take shape? How do those interact? How do those fit together? How does the information shape this world? Okay? Now, that's an issue that runs across all sorts of kind of streams of thought in human experience. Okay? So, just for instance, one of the big questions, like philosophically, is why is it that the math we do in our minds successfully describes features that you have in the world out there, right? Why does physics work, so to speak, right? It's not, there's something there. Like how does that information, how does it get there? We don't have great answers to that. Okay, but it's an issue. Likewise, like DNA, it's now clear that the DNA, it's something like a keyboard that encodes information, but the information is too big for the DNA to hold it all. So their information and DNA are two different things. Okay, and that DNA changes depending on what information gets into it. Okay? What is information? Where does it come from? All of that. It's a question. Okay? And it has to do with like the non-material and the material world and how those fit, how they interact. How does one produce another? You have this issue in ancient thought, in the developments that you get with Aristotle, where he has this account of soul as an immaterial something, and then spirit as this kind of physical energy moving around that is guided by soul. So again, how do those fit together? I don't know, but he has to, you have both of them as distinct, and there has to be some kind of interaction, right? And you have in the background this kind of broad ancient tradition of technology as some kind of revelation, right? That begins to shape the world. So just say there's this big issue out there that this could be some sort of a small bit of, okay? Now, let me just think about it this way for 1 second, and then I'll stop. And like I said, this is weird, I know, but I didn't write this, you know. So you say this. So here's the hybrid solution, okay? If there's something like this ancient Near Eastern sacred marriage that's envisioned, then you have both, as it were, the mixing. You have human beings coming together, and you have these higher beings being called down. Okay? That's implied in this. And here's the thing. Why are they the fallen ones? Why fallen ones? This has to do, remember, you have a line that begins with the discovery of prayer. They're jolted loose with this shock of realizing they're going to die. And something happens here, and there's this turn. And one way you could think about this is, you know, we were calling on the Lord, and we still died. Right? Maybe we need to call on something else. Maybe we need to call on something else. Okay? And so there's this attempt to sidestep death, to become bigger, better, to at least make a name that'll last, and a willingness to call on some other power in order to have that. It produces moral horrors and monstrosities, as it were. Okay, is kind of the picture that we have here. Now, let me just kind of drop this and then we can have a conversation. I'm going to stop talking, okay, because this is a lot of what ifs, okay? But this sounds like kind of a there's this move nowadays towards what's called, you know, transhumanism, right? And it's like, well, you know, we all die, and wouldn't it be great if we found a way to upload consciousness or, you know, do all these other things to, like, we can delete the human to become more immortal, right? That's still the promise, still the temptation, still the drive, okay? Now let me ask this, let's loop it back. We started with where is the fundamental moral coordinates? Where does that come from? You're looking at a face, right? And you see in that person somebody that's you're responsible to. It's not just interacting with ideas, but here's a person, right? And there's a discovery of responsibility and so forth. Let me suggest that that's the way out of this, right? What happens when you're like, oh, I'm gonna die? Well, one way is I'll become so big and impressive and then, right? And it's futile, right? But the other direction is instead I can look at you, and we're in this, and yeah, we're gonna die, but we don't have to become kind of twisted and turned in on ourselves and manipulative and harmful to each other. Instead, we can receive each other. And I can be there to make it a little bit better for you. And maybe in my face, then something will come back and we can be there for each other. Okay? And it's a different route. It's a different route. Okay. So I'll leave it there and let's open it up for conversation. I've said maybe too much.